Here's a beginner's guide to close reading. Close reading is a skill that you'll encounter and need to utilize in a variety of classes, fields, and disciplines. But for the purposes of our class, we can talk about close reading as a reading comprehension strategy that prompts readers to interpret an author's message by analyzing the author's rhetorical appeals. We're looking at the language itself in order to understand the author's message. Based on that definition, I can understand why students think that close reading is very academic and not applicable to their daily lives and not super exciting. However, we engage in practices of close reading every single day in very mundane ways. For example, let's imagine that it's 6:31 at night and you receive this text message. Hey, period. Can't go out tonight. Period. Maybe next time. Exclamation mark, yellow heart emoji. So on the surface, this text message seems kind of innocuous. Like, yeah, the language is there conveying a message, but in order to extrapolate more meaning from it, we're going to have to do a little close reading. For example, here's what close reading of this very short text message could look like. Why did they punctuate "hey" with the period instead of an exclamation mark? They didn't explain why they can't make whatever activity you had planned. Do they have plans or do they just not want to go? If they have plans, why not just say that? They said maybe next time, exclamation mark, but they didn't suggest a specific time. There was no explicit plan to reschedule. They did end the text message with an exclamation mark and a heart. So maybe they do mean that they want to see you later, and so on and so on and so on. We have all done the text message close reading spiral at one point or another. Similarly, but in a more academic context, we often engage in practices of close reading in literature classes. For example, here's an excerpt from every high school English teacher's favorite novel, it seems, F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. But above the gray land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive, after a moment, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. Their retinas are 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. Like that text message, this is a pretty short excerpt from a pretty long novel. However, let's try some close reading to find out what's actually happening in this passage, because there's not a whole lot of explicit action per se. So what exactly does Fitzgerald want us to get out of this passage? So an example of close reading could be here, Nick Carraway, who's the narrator in The Great Gatsby, describes how nature, that those spasms of bleak dust, has eroded a billboard advertisement that is trying to promote the services of ophthalmologist Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The dust has reduced the illustration of Dr. Eckelberg's face to a menacing pair of inhuman eyes, positioning the image as a monstrous figure overlooking the Valley of Ashes. So the core of our close reading comes into our reading of these inhuman eyes, these eyes that exist in a, quote, no face, end quote, as a kind of monstrous figure. Here we're extrapolating that Fitzgerald has positioned this almost like Gothic gargoyle in this passage. Obviously, our class is not a kind of pop culture class where we will be analyzing text messages, nor is it a literature-based English class. So for the purposes of writing Project 1, our rhetorical analysis, here's how you can spot rhetorical appeals using these strategies of close reading. For example, when we're close reading those chapters in Bad Ideas About Writing, we're primarily going to be looking for examples of ethos, which, as we've learned in previous lectures, means where and how the author invoked their own credibility. We're also going to be looking for logos, where and how the author employs reasoning skills, good logical reasoning skills. And finally, we're also going to be looking for examples of pathos, where and how the author uses emotive language. So here's a passage from another section of Bad Ideas About Writing that we're going to practice close reading. First-year writing also works like no other course to push students to explore the possibilities of language, to work with new and uncomfortable ideas and genres, and to analyze important issues and how they are argued in the public sphere. Part of this means getting students to develop better methods of writing and reading in digital environments, which involves discerning what philosopher Harry Frankfurt has called bullshit. A recent survey found that 84% of American students indicated they would benefit from learning whether or not certain online sources are trustworthy. Another study reported that around 82% of middle schoolers were unable to determine what was sponsored content and what was a real news story on a website. And being able to sift through the bullshit to find reliable sources, meaningful arguments, and a deeper intellectual exchange and public deliberation is a literacy skill developed specifically in first-year writing. And this is from Tyler Branson, and I've linked Bad Ideas About Writing down here if you want to read more in his chapter, First Year Composition Prepares Students for Academic Writing. So using the close reading skills that we've talked about earlier, where exactly do you see rhetorical appeals at work? And I would recommend pausing the presentation here, combing through the paragraph once more on your own, and seeing if you can identify places where ethos, logos, and pathos are at work. All right, hopefully you found some good examples on your own. Here's a few examples of places that stood out to me, and I just took less than a minute and combed through it again on my own and found specific words or phrases that I feel are explicit rhetorical appeals for Branson's target audience. So phrases like works like no other course, words like push, explore the possibilities of language, all of these words and phrases are working together to position first-year composition, first-year writing courses as unique, as having a very particular and individual value for first-year students in the university setting. The appeal that probably jumped out to most of you the most explicitly is Branson's usage of Harry Frankfurt's invocation of the word bullshit. Now, this is a rhetorical appeal, even though it seems unusual in academic writing. I would wager that many of you have never seen an explicit curse word used in academic, published, peer-reviewed scholarly writing. It's something that we see used in fiction and writing that's intended for public or general audiences, but it's kind of unusual to see in this context. So we're going to unpack why exactly Branson would choose to zero in on that particular word and why he would use Frankfurt as a source. You can see also that he refers to some surveys here. We come back to bullshit by closer to the end of the paragraph. And then we have a pretty powerful closing sentence. So let's break down which rhetorical appeals are at play here. Remember that there can sometimes be some overlap in ethos, logos, and pathos in any kind of writing. So you might see a little bit of overlap here, but I think that all three of the major rhetorical appeals are at work here. For example, we can see ethos at work through Branson's tone. It's authoritative, the writing style, even the sentence structure is straightforward, and his subjects and verbs are clear throughout his writing. He also uses logos through the usage of a clear topic sentence at the very beginning of his paragraph, the sentence about first-year writing and the role that it can play for students and the value that it has. Branson also uses compelling pieces of evidence to support that topic sentence. Like we talked about before, he calls upon Frankfurt. He introduces one survey, and then in the following sentence, he brings up another recent study. So we're relying on outside reliable sources to create a new conclusion, which is something you're welcome to do in your own writing. Branson also uses pathos, and even though sometimes we think of pathos, for instance, in the Mad Men examples that we've used so far in this course, sometimes pathos can be understood as like the pretty emotions, and they don't necessarily have to be. Pathos won't always be nostalgia or love or a sense of community. Sometimes they can be ugly feelings as well. So by echoing Frankfurt's usage of bullshit, Branson is really banking on getting a reaction from his target audience. And the usage of a curse word makes this piece of writing very casual and not typically academic. Branson also uses pathos in his ability to, or rather, in tying the ability to properly read and analyze source material and finding deeper, broader importance in that skill that students hone. Remember, in that very last sentence, he talks about the deeper intellectual exchange and public deliberation. So Branson here uses all three of the major rhetorical appeals. And congratulations, in less than 5 minutes, you guys have started a complex rhetorical analysis, which is exactly what you're going to do with your own chosen chapter. Some of you may be wondering, okay, this information is nice to have, but where should I go from here in terms of my own personal project? Number one, I would suggest that you read your chosen chapter from Bad Ideas About Writing a couple of times. Get really familiar with the material so that you can start to fully understand the content of what your author is saying. What's their message? What's their purpose in writing? Secondly, you're going to want to highlight important content pieces so that you can start to write the summary portion of your rhetorical analysis. So just like we did in that really small paragraph, you're going to do that to your whole chapter. Start to find important sentences, main ideas. If you had 30 seconds to summarize your chosen chapter to someone who's not in our class, what would you say that author is writing about? Thirdly, I would encourage you to close read your chosen chapter, taking note of places where you see rhetorical appeals at work. And the first step of this particular strategy can be something as like, I think the author is doing something interesting here, but I can't really put my finger on what it is quite yet. That line of thought is totally fine at this process. If it sticks out to you, mark it, circle back to it. And then finally, use all of these pieces together to start to consider how you want to organize the analysis portion of your rhetorical analysis. If you follow all of these steps, you'll have a great jumping off point for the first draft of your rhetorical analysis.